that falls on free trade. Canadians were also told repeatedly that we could not compete with a country 10 times our size. My government had more confidence in the ability of Canadian firms to compete on an even playing field, and we contended further that if we could not compete successfully in North America, we certainly couldn't compete with the rest of the world. Fortunately, when confronted with a clear choice, Canadians rallied to our position, and we won the election again with a large majority. These statistics alone speak to the success of the free trade. Trade volumes more than tripled in less than 25 years, from $235 billion to $881 billion last year. Trade exploded into the largest bilateral exchanges between any two countries in the history of the world, creating millions of new jobs and record prosperity on both sides of the border. The free trade agreement proved to be precisely the jolt out of complacency that our businesses needed. The economic results were even more positive than anyone, including me, envisioned at the time. In the time that we're together here today, more than $200 million in goods and services will be exchanged by Canada and the US. That's more than $1 million every minute of every hour of every day. $2 billion in total, each and every day of every week, of every month, of every year. I would like to think that the free trade agreement provided a maturing tonic of sorts for Canada as well. We demonstrated in no uncertain terms that we could indeed compete with the Americans and others around the world and come out winners. And it also cleared the air of the old doubts and fears about our capacity to grow and prosper as a mature, distinctive country, living as we do, cheek by jowl, next to the richest and most powerful nation in world history. It required a change in our mentality from defensive and fearful to confident and ambitious, which we are today. Over the decades, much strong leadership has resulted in significant international trade achievements for this nation, including the negotiation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA more than 30 years ago, which now constitutes, NAFTA, almost 500 million people, the largest, richest, and most dynamic free trade area in the world, with a combined GDP reaching almost $21 trillion last year, and with less than 7%, listen to this one, with less than 7% of the world's population, the NAFTA partners represent more than 28% of the world's total GDP. And more than 55 million new jobs have been created in the NAFTA countries since the signing of the treaty. The formal NAFTA negotiations that will begin in the fall are crucial, absolutely crucial for Canada. Now there's a big ticket item for you, for the history books. That's going to be the challenge of this government and of this Parliament and of this country. If you examine fairly the results of our international trade negotiating experience, one would have to conclude, however, that over the decades, Canada has done pretty well. Our negotiation of the Auto Pact with the US in 1964, led by Prime Minister Pearson, brought unprecedented prosperity to Ontario. The free trade negotiations from 85 to 87 that I concluded with President Reagan, and then followed by the NAFTA that I signed with Presidents Bush and Salinas, produced a blowout in jobs, investment, and prosperity for this country. It had taken Canada 125 years to generate a GDP of $800 billion. Under free trade, it took only 25 years to double that. And recently, the valuable Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement initiated by the Harper government and successfully concluded by the Trudeau ministry with our Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time Chrystia Freeland performing acrobatics in Europe to get this thing signed and done on time. And that too is going to ensure thousands of new jobs in Canada and billions of dollars added to our GDP. Look, the Americans are going to arrive at the NAFTA bargaining table with a precise agenda articulated by some tough and skilled representatives. They too have done extremely well in this area over the years. A country that has an unemployment rate today of 4.3%, the lowest of any industrialized country in the world, cannot seriously argue that it's done poorly with its international agreements that create such vast employment opportunities at home and in America. But Canada shall have its own list of demands, and with preparation, patience, and traditional Canadian competence, I am persuaded that the highly talented and capable team put together by Prime Minister Trudeau has the opportunity to do a top-flight job for Canada. And I'm confident that that is what it will happen. And this will result in a modernized NAFTA that will continue to produce tremendous benefits for all three countries, including the millions of new jobs that our children, all of us here today, that our children and grandchildren will require in the future. You know that time is the ally of leaders who place the defensive principle ahead of the pursuit of popularity. And history has little time for the marginal roles played by the carpers and complainers, and less for their opinions. History tends to focus on the builders, the deciders, the leaders, in education, healthcare, science, business, the arts, as well as politics, because they are the men and women whose contributions have shaped the destiny of Canada. Like other privileged nations, Canada, Mexico, and America, and those in Europe, are often extremely resistant to change. But deep and important structural changes are indispensable, however, to maintain a growing economy and ensure the flourishing of peace and prosperity that can only be brought about by a firm expression of political will. As Maureen Dowd noted some years ago in reference to the United States, and Maureen wrote, "In a nation ruled by polls and ratings, where even newspapers hire focus groups to find out what kind of news their readers want, we are losing sight of something," she said, "that we should have learned as teenagers. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right." In fact, transforming leadership, leadership that makes a significant difference in the life of our nation, recognizes that political capital is acquired to be spent, not hoarded, to be spent in great causes for one's country. And this is precisely such a time. Presidents and prime ministers are not chosen to seek popularity. They are chosen to provide leadership. There are times when the voters must be told not what they want to hear, but what they have to know. And what they have to know is a quotation from the book of Proverbs, which is inscribed on the Peace Tower over here in Ottawa, which says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." Leaders must have vision, and they must find the courage to fight for the policies that will give that vision life. Leaders must govern not for easy headlines in 10 days, but for a better Canada in 10 years. And they must be ready to endure the attacks that often accompany profound or controversial change, while they await the distant and compelling sounds of a verdict that only history and a more reflective nation can render in the fullness of time. 20 years ago, the Kennedy Library Foundation saluted President Gerald R. Ford with the Profiles in Courage Award for pardoning Richard Nixon. It was an historic decision, deeply unpopular for Mr. Ford at the time, but as it turned out, right for America. I remember a lunch with Jerry and Betty Ford, Mila and me, in Vail, when Mila said to him, "Jerry, did you realize when you made that decision about President Nixon how tough it was going to be?" And he said, "Mila, I realized it. I thought I'd be defeated as a result of it. But the option was the paralysis of America for 3 years, while the President of the United States sat in criminal trial in the accused box in Washington, D.C. And that I could not abide. So I made the decision knowing full well what was going to happen." Well, in an insightful essay, David Gergen, counselor to 4 presidents, wrote that in saluting President Ford that day for his courage in making the tough decision, the trustees of the Kennedy Library were actually doing more. He said, "They are telling leaders everywhere to pay less attention to daily polls and more attention to their inner voices. Give up the slavish obedience to popular opinion so embedded in politics today, and take up the standard of what's right, even when it threatens one's political survival." As Jerry Ford found, you may be condemned by millions, but one day, perhaps a quarter century later, you will win an honored place in history. Winston Churchill defined the Canada-US relationship as the Prime Minister said in his trip to Washington. Churchill defined the Canada-US relationship in all of its glory almost 80 years ago with the golden words, "That long frontier from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, guarded only by neighborly respect and honorable obligations, is an example to every country and a pattern for the future of the world." And President Clinton observed one day that leadership is the capacity to look around the corner of history just a little bit. Well, that's the leadership challenge confronting the NAFTA negotiators, to look around the corner of history and to conduct themselves in such a way, in an atmosphere of robust discussions leavened by a spirit of reasonable compromise, that the product of their successful efforts will be viewed by history as a wise and a powerful enhancement of Churchill's words. And if we can summon the courage to defend those values that made our country so successful, then we will have contributed significantly to building a world that resists terror everywhere, at all costs, and promotes peace and prosperity in all 3 nations, both at home and around the world. In the Old Testament, it is written that young men have visions and old men dream dreams. Great countries like Canada require that strength of the youth and the wisdom of those who are a little bit older combined to ensure that this great Canada, soon to celebrate our 150th birthday, can look back 150 years from now and say the leadership in that generation made the strength of Canada today. When we challenged the leadership on our 150th birthday, they were not found wanting. And that is to the honor of Canada, to be celebrated by all of us at all times as we reflect upon the magnificence of the heritage we've received by becoming Canadian citizens. Thank you all.